When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled through radio speakers across the nation, announcing the unconditional surrender to Allied forces. Millions of Japanese soldiers laid down their arms, accepting defeat after years of brutal warfare across the Pacific. The Second World War had finally ended. Or had it? In the dense jungles of the Philippines, the remote islands of Indonesia, and the caves of Guam, hundreds of Japanese soldiers never received the message. Cut off from command, trained to never surrender, and convinced that any news of Japan's defeat was enemy propaganda, these men continued their lonely war for years, even decades, after the rest of the world had moved on. Some fought until the 1970s, nearly 30 years after the war's end. These are the stories of the soldiers who didn't know World War II had ended, the holdouts who became living ghosts of a conflict long finished, and the extraordinary circumstances that finally brought them home. In this video, we will find out. So, without further ado, let's start with the first name on our list. Hiroo Onoda is perhaps the most famous of all Japanese holdouts, a man who continued his guerrilla war in the jungles of Lubang Island in the Philippines for an astonishing 29 years after Japan's surrender. Born on March 19, 1922 in Kainan, Wakayama Prefecture, Onoda came from a family of modest means. His father managed a small business, and young Hiroo showed early signs of the determination and discipline that would define his entire life. At age 17, he began working for a trading company in China, an experience that exposed him to military culture and the expanding Japanese empire. In 1942, as the Pacific War intensified, Onoda was conscribed into the Imperial Japanese Army. Unlike many conscripts who received basic training and were sent to the front lines, Onoda demonstrated qualities that caught the attention of his superiors. He was selected for intelligence training at the Nakano School, an elite institution that trained officers in guerrilla warfare, sabotage, intelligence gathering, and most importantly, the ability to operate independently behind enemy lines for extended periods. The school's curriculum emphasized self-sufficiency, survival skills, and unwavering loyalty to the emperor and Japan. Students were taught that surrender was never an option, that they should fight until death or until they received direct orders from a superior officer to stand down. This indoctrination would prove to be both Onoda's greatest strength and his most tragic burden. In December 1944, with the tide of war turning decisively against Japan, Second Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda received his orders. He was to be deployed to Lubang Island, a small landmass about 75 miles southwest of Manila in the Philippines. His mission was clear and direct: conduct guerrilla warfare, gather intelligence, and under no circumstances surrender or take his own life. His commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, gave him explicit instructions that would echo in Onoda's mind for 3 decades. The major told him that he might be stuck on the island for 3, 4, or even 5 years, but eventually someone would come for him. Until that moment arrived, Onoda was to continue his mission. He was to sabotage enemy installations, disrupt supply lines, and survive at all costs. These orders, delivered with the full authority of the Imperial Japanese Army, became Onoda's unshakable reality. He landed on Lubang in late December 1944, joining a small group of Japanese soldiers already stationed there. The initial force numbered around 200 men, but they were poorly equipped and faced overwhelming Allied superiority. Within months, American and Filipino forces launched a major offensive to retake the Philippines. Most of the Japanese garrison was killed in combat or surrendered. By the end of February 1945, fewer than 40 Japanese soldiers remained alive on Lubang, scattered and disorganized. Onoda, along with 3 other soldiers, withdrew deep into the mountainous jungle interior of the island, determined to continue the fight as ordered. The 4 men who formed this tiny resistance cell were Second Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda, Private Yuichi Akatsu, Corporal Shoichi Shimada, and Private First Class Kinshichi Kozuka. They established a hidden camp high in the mountains, avoiding all contact with the local Filipino population, except when necessary to acquire supplies, which usually meant stealing food from farms. They took what they needed to survive: bananas, coconuts, rice when they could find it, and occasionally a cow for meat. Every theft was justified in their minds as a legitimate military operation against the enemy. From their perspective, the war was still raging, and the Philippines remained occupied territory under Allied control. They observed Filipino villages and the occasional passing, patrol, interpreting everything through the lens of ongoing warfare. Leaflets were dropped over the island by Allied forces and later by Japanese search parties, announcing the war's end and urging any remaining soldiers to surrender. Onoda and his men found these leaflets, read them carefully, and dismissed them as enemy propaganda designed to trick them into giving up. The leaflets were too clean, too perfectly printed, they reasoned. If Japan had truly surrendered, why would the enemy need such elaborate deception? Surely, they thought, if the surrender were real, a proper Japanese officer would come in person to deliver the orders. For several years, the four men maintained their vigil, stealing food, avoiding detection, and occasionally engaging in minor sabotage. In 1949, after nearly 4 years of isolation and hardship, Private Yuichi Akatsu could no longer endure the strain. Suffering from malnutrition, constant stress, and growing doubts about their mission, Akatsu decided to leave the group. On September 1949, he separated from the others and made his way down from the mountains. 6 months later, in March 1950, he surrendered to Filipino authorities. His emergence sent shockwaves through both the Philippines and Japan. Akatsu reported that at least 3 other Japanese soldiers were still hiding in Lubang's jungles, convinced the war continued. Japanese authorities, working with Filipino officials, immediately launched new efforts to convince the remaining holdouts to come out. More leaflets were dropped, this time bearing photographs of Akatsu and messages from family members. Letters from Onoda's own family were included, pleading with him to come home. Search parties combed the jungle, calling out to the holdouts in Japanese. But Onoda, Shimada, and Kozuka remained unconvinced. They examined the new leaflets with suspicion. The photographs could be faked, they decided. The letters could have been written under duress. The whole operation seemed too convenient, too desperate. If Japan had truly won or surrendered honorably, why all this effort to flush them out? The 3 remaining soldiers continued their existence in the jungle, developing sophisticated survival techniques. They created calendars from bamboo to track the days, maintained their rifles and ammunition with meticulous care, and established multiple campsites that they rotated through to avoid detection. They became experts at reading the jungle, knowing every trail, every water source, and every potential danger. Decades passed. The 1950s gave way to the 1960s. Lubang Island developed and modernized around them. Roads were built, electricity arrived, and tourism began to flourish. Yet in the mountains, 3 soldiers remained frozen in 1945, fighting a war that existed only in their minds. On May 7th, 1954, tragedy struck the small group. Corporal Shoichi Shimada was killed in a firefight with a Filipino search patrol. He had been with Onoda for nearly 10 years, enduring hunger, disease, and constant danger. His death left only Onoda and Kozuka, 2 men alone against the world. They buried Shimada in the jungle and renewed their commitment to continue the mission. They had come too far, sacrificed too much, to give up now. If Shimada died for the mission, then they would honor his memory by persevering. The 2 remaining soldiers continued their guerrilla activities for another 18 years, an almost incomprehensible span of time. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Onoda and Kozuka periodically descended from their mountain hideouts to raid farms for food. These raids brought them into occasional conflict with local farmers and Philippine police. Several firefights occurred, resulting in casualties on both sides. The Philippine government launched multiple operations to either capture or kill the 2 holdouts, who were now considered bandits and criminals responsible for theft and murder. In October 1972, Kozuka was killed by police during one such confrontation. After 27 years of shared struggle, Hiroo Onoda was suddenly utterly alone. He was 50 years old, had spent more than half his life in the jungle, and now faced the prospect of continuing his mission in complete isolation. Most people would have given up at this point. The psychological toll of such loneliness would break nearly anyone. But Onoda had been trained too well, believed too deeply, and committed too thoroughly to abandon his post. He retreated deeper into the jungle, becoming even more cautious, even more elusive. He continued to maintain his rifle, continued to observe the island's developments, and continued to wait for orders from a superior officer. By the early 1970s, Onoda had become a legend in both the Philippines and Japan. Newspapers covered his story, speculating about whether he was still alive after Kozuka's death. Some thought he must have perished in the jungle. Others believed he would continue indefinitely. The Japanese government, feeling responsible for one of its soldiers still fighting a war 3 decades after its conclusion, made renewed efforts to bring Onoda home. They understood that conventional search operations had failed repeatedly. The problem wasn't finding evidence of Onoda, it was convincing him to surrender. In 1974, a young Japanese adventurer named Norio Suzuki decided to find Onoda himself. Suzuki was an unconventional traveler who famously stated he wanted to find Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman in that order. In February 1974, Suzuki traveled to Lubang Island and ventured into the jungle unarmed and alone. Remarkably, after only 4 days of searching, he encountered Onoda. The meeting was surreal. Suzuki explained that the war had ended nearly 30 years ago, that Japan had rebuilt and prospered, and that Onoda was urgently needed at home. Onoda listened politely but remained unconvinced. He had heard similar stories before. However, Onoda told Suzuki that he would surrender only if he received direct orders from his commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, the man who had sent him to Lubang in 1944. Suzuki returned to Japan with photographs of Onoda and news that he was alive, well and willing to surrender under specific conditions. The Japanese government immediately located Major Taniguchi, who was now retired and living quietly in Japan. Taniguchi, now an old man, agreed to travel to Lubang Island to personally relieve Onoda of his duty. On March 9, 1974, Major Taniguchi, accompanied by Japanese officials and Philippine authorities, met Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda in the jungle. After 29 years, 2 months, and 24 days, Onoda's war finally ended. Taniguchi, wearing his old uniform, formally read the order. Onoda's mission was complete, he was relieved of duty, and he was commanded to surrender his weapons and return to Japan. Only then, hearing the direct order from his former commanding officer, did Onoda accept that World War II had truly ended. He emerged from the jungle on March 10, 1974, wearing a tattered uniform, carrying his still-functioning rifle, 500 rounds of ammunition, several hand grenades, and a sword. His surrender made international headlines. Photographs of Onoda, ramrod straight despite his age, formally presenting his sword and rifle to Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos, circled the globe. He was 52 years old but looked much older, weathered by 3 decades in the jungle. The Philippine government faced a difficult decision. Onoda had technically committed numerous crimes during his holdout period, including theft and involvement in deaths of Filipino citizens. However, President Marcos, recognizing the unique circumstances and the international attention, granted Onoda a full pardon. Onoda returned to Japan as a national hero to some and a controversial figure to others. The Japan he found was completely unrecognizable from the one he had left in 1944. The devastated militaristic empire had transformed into a peaceful, prosperous democracy. The emperor was no longer a divine figure but a constitutional monarch. The values Onoda had fought for, the Japan he had preserved in his memory, no longer existed. The psychological adjustment proved enormously difficult. Onoda struggled with modern life, finding Japanese society too soft, too materialistic, and too disconnected from the warrior values he cherished. The nation had moved on without him, and he felt like a relic from another age. In 1975, frustrated and unable to adapt, Onoda emigrated to Brazil, where he purchased a cattle ranch and lived a quiet life, raising cattle and training young people in survival skills. He married in 1976 and found some peace in the remote Brazilian countryside, far from the modern Japan he could not accept. Onoda eventually returned to Japan in 1984 and established a nature school for young people, teaching survival skills and self-reliance. He wrote a book about his experiences titled No Surrender, My 30-Year War, which became an international bestseller. In it, he reflected on his experiences without regret, maintaining that he had done his duty as ordered. He never apologized for the deaths or damage caused during his holdout, viewing them as legitimate acts of war. Until his death on January 16, 2014, at the age of 91, Onoda remained proud of his service and his unwavering commitment to his orders. His story continues to fascinate historians and psychologists, raising profound questions about duty, obedience, and the human capacity for commitment. How could a man remain committed to a mission for 3 decades after it had become obsolete? What does Onoda's story tell us about the power of indoctrination, the nature of loyalty, and the difficulty of accepting paradigm shifts in our understanding of reality? These questions remain relevant today, making Hiroo Onoda's story more than just a curious historical footnote, but a profound meditation on human nature itself. Moving to another remarkable case, Teruo Nakamura holds the distinction of being the last Japanese soldier to surrender after World War II, emerging from hiding in December 1974, 9 months after Onoda and nearly 30 years after Japan's defeat. Born in 1919 in Taiwan, which was then a Japanese colony, Nakamura belonged to the indigenous Amis people. His original name was Atun Palalin, but like many indigenous Taiwanese during the Japanese colonial period, he was given a Japanese name and identity as part of the empire's assimilation policies. The Ames people, one of Taiwan's indigenous tribes, had been incorporated into the Japanese Empire when Japan took control of Taiwan in 1895 following the First Sino-Japanese War. By the time Nakamura reached adulthood, Taiwan had been under Japanese rule for decades, and the colonial administration actively recruited indigenous Taiwanese into the military, often assigning them to labor battalions or support roles rather than frontline combat positions. In 1943, as Japan's war effort grew increasingly desperate and manpower shortages became critical, Nakamura was conscripted into the Imperial Japanese Army at the age of 24. He received basic military training, but, like many indigenous Taiwanese recruits, was not fully integrated into regular Japanese units. Instead, he was assigned to a labor and support unit. In 1944, he was deployed to Morotai Island, part of the Maluku Islands in present-day Indonesia. His unit's role was to support Japanese defensive operations, build fortifications, and provide logistical assistance to combat troops. Morotai, though strategically located, was a relatively small island, and the Japanese garrison there was modest compared to major strongholds in the Pacific. When Allied forces, primarily American and Australian troops, invaded Morotai in September 1944 as part of General Douglas MacArthur's island-hopping campaign, the Japanese defenders were quickly overwhelmed. The invasion of Morotai was a stunning success for the Allies, who secured the island in just a few weeks with minimal casualties. The Japanese garrison, outnumbered and outgunned, either perished in combat or surrendered. However, some soldiers, including Nakamura, managed to escape into the dense jungle interior of the island rather than face capture. Nakamura, along with a small group of other soldiers, fled into the mountains and jungles of Morotai, where they attempted to continue resistance operations. However, the group quickly fragmented. Some died from disease, others from starvation, and still others were killed in skirmishes with Allied patrols. Within months, Nakamura found himself alone, the sole survivor of his unit. Unlike Hiroo Onoda, who maintained a military mission and continued guerrilla operations, Nakamura's situation was different. He was not an elite intelligence officer trained in long-term guerrilla warfare. He was a former laborer and low-ranking soldier who simply found himself stranded on a remote island with no way home. Rather than actively fighting, Nakamura focused on survival. He built a small hut deep in the jungle far from any settlements or roads. He cultivated a hidden garden where he grew vegetables, including sweet potatoes, taro, and other crops. He trapped small animals, collected rainwater, and lived an existence that was more hermit than soldier. For nearly 30 years, he survived in total isolation, seeing no other human beings, speaking to no one, and living in a tiny, self-sufficient world carved out of the jungle. The isolation Nakamura endured was almost unimaginable. While Onoda had companions for most of his time in hiding and maintained a sense of purpose through his mission, Nakamura spent 3 decades utterly alone. He had no radio, no contact with the outside world, and no way of knowing what had happened since 1944. The war, the surrender, the rebuilding of Japan, the independence of Indonesia, the entire transformation of the post-war world, all of this occurred without his knowledge. He existed in a bubble frozen in time, a small patch of jungle where every day was the same as the last. The psychological impact of such extreme isolation is difficult to comprehend. Most people would have gone mad or given up. Yet Nakamura persisted, tending his garden, maintaining his shelter, and surviving day after day, year after year, decade after decade. His survival speaks to both remarkable resilience and perhaps a deep sense of hopelessness. A man who saw no alternative but to continue existing in his isolated world. In 1974, an Indonesian Air Force pilot conducting a routine aerial survey spotted something unusual in the remote jungle of Morotai Island. From the air, he observed a small cleared area with what appeared to be a primitive hut and cultivated plots. This was strange because that particular area was uninhabited and far from any villages or settlements. Intrigued and suspicious, the pilot reported his findings to authorities, who dispatched a patrol to investigate. When Indonesian soldiers reached the clearing, they found a small, weather-beaten man tending a garden. He appeared elderly, wore tattered remnants of what might have once been a military uniform, and seemed startled but not hostile. Through gestures and broken communication, the soldiers realized this was a Japanese soldier who had been living there for decades. Nakamura, confronted with armed soldiers, did not resist. He had no weapons beyond basic tools and showed no inclination to fight. He was taken into custody and transported to a local military base, where Japanese officials were contacted. The discovery of Nakamura caused an international sensation, coming just 9 months after Hiroo Onoda's surrender. Here was another Japanese holdout, found on a remote Indonesian island who had survived for 30 years, without human contact. However, Nakamura's case was complicated by his status. He was not ethnically Japanese, but indigenous Taiwanese. When he was conscripted, Taiwan was a Japanese colony, but by 1974, Taiwan and mainland China were both claiming sovereignty over the island, and Indonesia had long since gained independence from the Netherlands. Questions arose about Nakamura's citizenship and where he should be repatriated. The Japanese government, recognizing its responsibility for a former soldier, arranged for his return to Japan. Nakamura arrived in Japan in January 1975, to considerably less fanfare than Onoda had received. While Onoda was treated as a hero by many, Nakamura was viewed more as a curiosity. He spoke limited Japanese, having spent most of his life speaking his native Amis language, and he struggled to communicate with officials and media. His arrival in Japan highlighted the complicated legacy of Japanese colonialism and the often overlooked role of colonial subjects in Japan's war effort. Nakamura remained in Japan for only a short time before expressing a desire to return to Taiwan, where he still had family. However, his return to Taiwan proved bittersweet. The Taiwan he remembered from 1943 had changed dramatically. The island was no longer a Japanese colony, but was under the control of the Republic of China government, which had fled mainland China in 1949. The Amis community he returned to had also changed, modernized, and integrated into Taiwanese society in ways that made him feel like an outsider. Nakamura struggled to readjust, finding himself a man without a country, belonging neither to Japan, Taiwan, nor Indonesia, but trapped between all three. He had lost 30 years of his life to isolation, and the world had moved on without him. The family he returned to were strangers. His community had evolved beyond recognition, and he carried the deep psychological scars of 3 decades alone. Nakamura lived quietly in Taiwan for several years, rarely speaking about his experiences. He died in 1979, just 5 years after his rescue at the age of 59. His death received minimal attention, a sad end for a man whose extraordinary survival story deserved more recognition. Nakamura's story differs from other holdouts in important ways. He was not driven by ideological commitment or military duty in the same way Onoda was. He was not waiting for orders or maintaining a guerrilla campaign. Instead, he was simply a man who found himself stranded and alone, who survived through ingenuity and perseverance, but who paid an enormous psychological price. His 3 decades of total isolation may have been even more traumatic than the experiences of holdouts who maintained some human contact, even if only with fellow soldiers. The loneliness, the silence, the years without conversation or companionship, these likely inflicted wounds that never fully healed. Nakamura's case also highlights the often overlooked experiences of colonial subjects in World War II. Millions of people from Japanese colonies and occupied territories were conscripted, forced to labor, or otherwise compelled to participate in Japan's war effort. Their stories are frequently marginalized in historical narratives that focus on Japanese or Allied experiences. Nakamura represents these forgotten soldiers, men who fought in a war not truly their own, for a country that was not fully theirs and who suffered consequences that lasted long after the conflict ended. Another fascinating case among Japanese holdouts is that of Shoichi Yokoi, who spent 28 years hiding in the jungles of Guam before his accidental discovery in 1972. Born on March 31, 1915, in Saori, Aichi Prefecture, Japan, Yokoi grew up in a traditional Japanese family during a period of rapid modernization and militarization. Unlike Onoda, who came from a relatively prosperous background and received elite training, Yokoi's origins were humble. He worked as a tailor before being drafted into the Imperial Japanese Army in 1941, just as tensions with the United States reached a breaking point. Yokoi received basic infantry training and was deployed to Manchuria, where he served for 2 years in occupation duties. In 1944, recognizing the deteriorating situation in the Pacific, the Japanese military redeployed thousands of troops from Manchuria to reinforce island garrisons threatened by American advances. Yokoi was among these reinforcements, transferred to Guam in February 1944 as part of the garrison intended to defend the island against the anticipated American invasion. Guam, a crucial strategic location in the Mariana Islands, had been an American territory until December 1941, when Japanese forces captured it just days after the attack on Pearl Harbor. For 2.5 years, Guam remained under Japanese occupation, with the local Chamorro population enduring harsh treatment under military rule. By mid-1944, American OIE forces were advancing through the Pacific, and Guam became a priority target for recapture. On July 21, 1944, American forces launched Operation Forager, the invasion to retake Guam. The battle was fierce and bloody, lasting 3 weeks and resulting in heavy casualties on both sides. The Japanese garrison of approximately 18,000 men fought with characteristic determination, but American firepower and numerical superiority proved overwhelming. By August 10, 1944, organized Japanese resistance had collapsed. Most Japanese soldiers died in combat or committed suicide rather than surrender, following the military code that considered surrender shameful. However, some soldiers, including Yokoi and a small group of others, managed to escape into the dense jungle interior of the island rather than face certain death or capture. Yokoi, along with 9 other Japanese soldiers, fled into the jungle-covered mountains of southern Guam, determined to avoid capture and continue resistance if possible. The group quickly recognized that active guerrilla warfare was impractical. Guam was firmly under American control, with military bases being rapidly expanded and the local population cooperating with U.S. forces. Any aggressive action would quickly bring overwhelming retaliation. Instead, the group focused on survival, hiding deep in the jungle and avoiding all contact with Americans and the Chamorro population. For the first few years, Yokoi and his companions lived communally, sharing resources and supporting each other. They survived on fruits, nuts, fish, river shrimp, rats, and frogs. They knew the war had ended because they found leaflets dropped by American forces announcing Japan's surrender. But like other holdouts, they dismissed these as enemy propaganda. The leaflets seemed too perfect, too detailed. Surely, they reasoned, if Japan had truly surrendered, they would have heard it from Japanese authorities, not American propaganda materials. As years passed, the group began to fragment. Some men died from disease, particularly tropical illnesses like dengue fever and dysentery for which they had no medicine. Others simply disappeared, their fate unknown. By 1950, only 3 men remained, Yokoi and 2 others. The 3 survivors made a mutual agreement. They would separate to increase their chances of survival, living independently but checking on each other periodically. They designated specific meeting points where they would leave signs of their continued survival. This arrangement continued for about 14 years. During this time, Yokoi demonstrated remarkable ingenuity and craftsmanship. Using his training as a tailor and his basic survival skills, he created an elaborate underground hideout. He dug a cave into the riverbank near the Talafofo River, carefully concealing the entrance with vegetation. The cave was small, about 1 meter high and 2 meters wide, but it provided shelter from the elements and protection from discovery. He lined the floor with bamboo and created a sleeping platform. The cave was positioned so that smoke from any small cooking fire would disperse before reaching the surface, preventing detection. Yokoi maintained a remarkably civilized existence despite his primitive conditions. He wove clothes from hibiscus bark fiber, demonstrating his tailoring skills by creating surprisingly well-made garments, including shirts, pants, and even a jacket. He fashioned tools from bamboo, metal scraps he scavenged, and other natural materials. He created fishing hooks from bent wire, made traps for rats and small animals, and developed an efficient system for collecting rainwater. His daily routine involved checking his traps, gathering edible plants, fishing in the river at night when detection was less likely, and maintaining his equipment. He kept track of time by noticing seasonal changes and using a primitive calendar system. The isolation was profound, but Yokoi developed coping mechanisms. He talked to himself, worked on projects to keep his mind active, and maintained strict discipline in his daily activities. This routine, monotonous as it was, likely preserved his sanity during nearly 3 decades of solitude. In 1964, tragedy struck when Yokoi discovered that his 2 remaining companions had died. He found their bodies in separate locations, both apparently having succumbed to illness or starvation. From that moment, Yokoi was completely alone, the sole survivor of the 10 soldiers who had fled into the jungle 20 years earlier. For the next 8 years, he continued his solitary existence, now without even the occasional reassurance of knowing other Japanese survivors were nearby. The loneliness must have been crushing. He had no one to talk to, no one to share memories with, no one to confirm his reality. Yet he persevered, maintaining his hideout, continuing his survival routine, and clinging to the belief that one day he might be able to return to Japan with honor. He later stated that he believed Japan might eventually win the war or at least negotiate a favorable peace, at which time Japanese forces would return to Guam and he could rejoin his unit. This belief, however tenuous, gave him purpose and kept him alive. On January 24, 1972, 2 local Chamorro men, Jesus Duenas and Manuel de Gracia, were checking fish traps along the Talafofo River when they noticed something unusual. They spotted a man in tattered clothes near the riverbank. The man appeared elderly, had long unkempt hair and beard, and looked frightened when he saw them. Realizing this must be one of the legendary Japanese holdouts that local stories mentioned, they cautiously approached. Yokoi, caught completely off guard for the first time in decades, initially tried to flee but realized escape was impossible. Weak from years of inadequate nutrition and now 56 years old, he could not outrun younger men. He surrendered without resistance. The 2 men were shocked by what they found. Yokoi was emaciated, suffering from anemia and various nutritional deficiencies, but remarkably, he was coherent and lucid. They brought him to authorities, and within hours, news of his discovery spread around the world. Yokoi's emergence became a global sensation. Here was a man who had lived alone in the jungle for 8 years and in hiding for nearly 28 years total, surviving through pure determination and resourcefulness. American authorities on Guam treated him with compassion, providing medical care and informing Japanese officials immediately. Yokoi's first words upon being discovered became famous in Japan. He reportedly said, "It is with much embarrassment that I return alive." This statement reflected the deep shame he felt at having survived when so many of his comrades had died, and when the military code he lived by emphasized death before surrender. This sentiment resonated powerfully in Japan, where older generations still remembered the wartime values of sacrifice and honor, while younger generations were building a prosperous, peaceful society that had moved beyond such thinking. Yokoi's statement encapsulated the tragic disconnect between the Japan he remembered and the Japan that actually existed. Yokoi returned to Japan on February 2, 1972, to an enormous media frenzy. Thousands of people gathered to welcome him home. Unlike Onoda, who would return with military bearing and defiance, Yokoi appeared humble, almost apologetic. He was overwhelmed by the attention, the modern technology, and the dramatic changes in Japanese society. The Japan of 1972 was unrecognizable from the militaristic empire of 1941. The country had rebuilt from wartime devastation to become the world's second-largest economy. The emperor was a constitutional figurehead, democracy had replaced militarism, and Japanese society valued peace and prosperity over martial glory. Yokoi struggled to comprehend these changes. He had spent 28 years preparing to return to an empire that no longer existed. The adjustment was psychologically traumatic. However, unlike Onoda, who ultimately rejected modern Japan and moved to Brazil, Yokoi attempted to integrate into Japanese society. One of the most touching aspects of Yokoi's return was his reunion with his family. His mother had died during his absence, never knowing whether her son was alive or dead. His siblings had given up hope decades earlier, assuming he had perished during the Battle of Guam. Their reunion was emotional and bittersweet, a mixture of joy at his survival and grief for the lost decades. Yokoi also became a minor celebrity in Japan. His survival skills, particularly the clothing he had woven from plant fibers and his underground hideout, were displayed in museums. He gave lectures about his experiences and survival techniques. The media portrayed him as a symbol of Japanese perseverance and resourcefulness, though some critics questioned the wisdom of celebrating a man who had hidden while the nation rebuilt. In 1972, shortly after his return, Yokoi married a woman named Mihoko, whom he met through the publicity surrounding his discovery. The couple lived modestly, with Yokoi working various jobs and managing a small pension provided by the government. Despite his efforts to adapt, Yokoi never fully reconciled with modern Japan. He frequently criticized contemporary Japanese society for becoming too soft, too materialistic, and too removed from traditional values. He believed the post-war generation lacked discipline and appreciation for sacrifice. These views, while understandable given his experience, alienated him from many younger Japanese who saw him as an anachronism from a dark period in Japanese history. Yokoi also struggled with guilt. He felt ashamed that he had survived while so many comrades died, ashamed that he had hidden rather than fought, and ashamed that he had not contributed to Japan's post-war recovery. These feelings haunted him for the rest of his life. In public appearances, he often spoke about the importance of preparedness and self-reliance, urging Japanese to maintain survival skills and not become too dependent on modern conveniences. While some viewed these lectures as valuable wisdom from a remarkable survivor, others saw them as the outdated views of a man unable to accept change. Yokoi lived for another 25 years after his rescue, dying on September 22, 1997, at the age of 82. His later years were marked by declining health and increasing isolation. The initial media attention faded, and he became a footnote in history, occasionally remembered in documentaries or retrospective articles. His death received modest coverage, nowhere near the international attention his discovery had generated. Yokoi's legacy is complex. On one hand, his survival demonstrates extraordinary human resilience, ingenuity, and determination. His ability to endure 28 years in hiding, including 8 years of complete solitude, speaks to remarkable psychological and physical strength. On the other hand, his story is profoundly tragic. He spent the prime of his life hiding in a cave, missing out on family, relationships, and the opportunity to contribute to society. He returned to a world that had moved on without him, unable to fully participate in the very nation he had spent decades believing he was protecting. The question remains, was his survival a triumph or a tragedy? Perhaps it was both, a testament to human endurance that also highlights the terrible cost of war and the devastating effects of indoctrination. Moving forward in our exploration of these remarkable cases, we encounter Private Kozuka Kinshichi, who served alongside Hiroo Onoda for 27 years before his death in 1972. Born in 1920 in Tochigi Prefecture, Kozuka came from a farming family and received only basic education before being drafted into the Imperial Japanese Army in 1943. Unlike Onoda, who received elite intelligence training at the Nakano School, Kozuka was a regular infantryman assigned to a support unit. He was deployed to the Philippines in 1944 as part of the forces attempting to defend the islands from the advancing Americans. When American and Filipino forces overwhelmed Japanese positions on Lubang Island in early 1945, Kozuka was among the soldiers who retreated into the jungle rather than surrender or face certain death in combat. His decision to flee was not driven by specific orders or special training, but simply by the instinct for survival and the military indoctrination that surrender was unacceptable. Kozuka joined the group that would include Onoda, Private Yuichi Akatsu, and Corporal Shoichi Shimada. For the next 27 years, Kozuka lived a life of hardship and constant vigilance in the mountains of Lubang. While Onoda was technically the ranking officer and made strategic decisions, Kozuka was equally essential to the group's survival. He was skilled at foraging, an expert tracker, and physically strong despite chronic malnutrition. The partnership between Onoda and Kozuka, especially after Shimada's death in 1954, became one of the most enduring relationships in military history. Two men living in constant danger, relying completely on each other for survival, maintaining their mission despite overwhelming evidence that the war had ended. They developed a routine, a rhythm of existence that structured their days. They maintained their equipment, planned food raids, evaded search parties, and clung to the belief that their sacrifice had meaning. The years took their toll on both men, but they seemed to reinforce each other's commitment. When one felt doubt, the other would bolster his resolve. When one fell ill, the other would care for him. This mutual dependency created a bond that transcended normal friendship or military camaraderie. They were the only two people in the world who truly understood what the other was experiencing, the only two who shared their unique reality. Over the decades, they witnessed Lubang Island transform around them. They saw roads being built, heard the sounds of construction and vehicles, observed the arrival of electricity and modern amenities. Yet they interpreted all of this through the lens of their mission. These developments, they convinced themselves, were part of the American occupation. Japan would eventually liberate the Philippines, and their intelligence gathering would prove valuable. This interpretation allowed them to maintain their sense of purpose, even as the absurdity of their situation became increasingly apparent. On October 19, 1972, Kozuka and Onoda descended from their mountain hideout to raid a rice paddy, a type of operation they had conducted hundreds of times before. However, this time they were spotted by local police who had been alerted to their presence in the area. A firefight erupted, brief but deadly. Kozuka was shot and killed at the age of 52, dying almost instantly from his wounds. Onoda managed to escape back into the jungle, but he was now completely alone for the first time in nearly 3 decades. Kozuka's death was reported in both Philippine and Japanese media, reigniting interest in the remaining holdout. For Onoda, the loss was devastating. Kozuka had been his companion, his brother-in-arms, the only other person who understood their shared experience. Now that bond was severed, and Onoda faced the prospect of continuing alone. The psychological impact was profound. Onoda later stated that he considered ending his own mission after Kozuka's death, but ultimately decided to continue, feeling that to give up would dishonor Kozuka's memory and their shared sacrifice. Kozuka's body was returned to Japan and buried with military honors in his hometown. His family, who had long believed him dead, experienced the surreal pain of learning their son had survived for 27 years only to die just as the world was on the verge of bringing the holdouts home. If he had survived just 2 more years, he would have been rescued along with Onoda when Major Taniguchi delivered the orders to surrender. The cruel timing of his death underscores the tragedy of the holdout situation. Kozuka spent more than half his life fighting a war that had ended before he even went into hiding. He never married, never had children, never contributed to the rebuilding of Japan, and never experienced the peace and prosperity that his fellow citizens enjoyed. His entire adult life was consumed by a mission based on obsolete orders and a reality that no longer existed. Yet within the framework of his beliefs and training, Kozuka died doing his duty, fighting to the end as his military culture demanded. Whether this represents honor or waste depends on one's perspective. But the human cost is undeniable. The phenomenon of Japanese holdouts was not limited to famous cases like Onoda, Yokoi, and Nakamura. Dozens of other soldiers remained in hiding for extended periods after the war, each with their own story of survival, discovery, or death in isolation. One such case was Captain Sakai Oba, who led a group of holdouts on Saipan and earned the nickname the Fox of Saipan for his tactical brilliance and ability to evade capture. Born in 1914, Oba was a career army officer who arrived on Saipan in early 1944 as part of the Japanese garrison defending the island. When American forces invaded in June 1944, the battle was catastrophic for Japanese defenders. Over 30,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians died in the fighting, many in mass suicides off cliffs to avoid capture. The island fell to American control by July 1944, but Oba refused to surrender. He gathered approximately 50 surviving soldiers and some civilians, leading them into the island's mountainous interior. For more than a year, Oba conducted an effective guerrilla campaign against American forces, raiding supply depots, sabotaging equipment, and evading capture through clever tactics and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Unlike many holdouts who simply hid, Oba actively fought, organizing his men with military discipline and conducting operations that caused genuine concern for American commanders on Saipan. However, Oba was also pragmatic. As the months passed and Japan's defeat became undeniable, he began to question whether continuing the fight served any purpose. By late 1945, several months after Japan's official surrender, American authorities on Saipan made contact with Oba through intermediaries. Rather than simply broadcasting surrender appeals, they used Japanese prisoners who knew Oba personally to negotiate. One key intermediary was a Japanese officer who had been captured and who vouched for the authenticity of Japan's surrender and the honorable treatment of prisoners. After careful consideration and verification of the surrender terms, Captain Oba made a decision that distinguished him from other holdouts. On December 1, 1945, more than 3 months after Japan's official surrender, he led his remaining men and the civilians under his protection down from the mountains. They surrendered formally to American forces in a ceremony that showed mutual respect. Oba insisted that his men march in military formation, carrying their weapons, and surrender with dignity. American commanders, impressed by Oba's leadership and tactical skill, allowed this formal surrender. Photographs from that day show Oba and his men, thin and ragged but standing at attention, presenting their weapons with military bearing. Oba was repatriated to Japan in 1946, where he lived quietly until his death in 1992. His case demonstrates that not all holdouts remained in denial indefinitely. When presented with credible evidence and treated with respect, some were able to accept reality and end their resistance with dignity intact. Another significant case involved Second Lieutenant A. Yamaguchi and his group on Peleliu Island in Palau. Yamaguchi had participated in the brutal Battle of Peleliu in September and October 1944, one of the bloodiest engagements in the Pacific War. The battle saw nearly 11,000 Japanese defenders face over 40,000 American attackers in a fight that lasted 2 months and resulted in casualties on both sides far exceeding pre-battle estimates. The island's cave systems and coral ridges provided exceptional defensive positions, and Japanese forces fought with fanatical determination. When organized resistance finally collapsed in late November 1944, the vast majority of Japanese defenders were dead. However, Yamaguchi and a small group of soldiers managed to retreat into a complex of caves in the island's interior, where they continued to hide. They survived by raiding abandoned supply caches left by both Japanese and American forces, collecting rainwater and hunting small game. For 3 years, Yamaguchi's group remained hidden, occasionally observing American activities on the island but avoiding all contact. Unlike Onoda's active guerrilla operations or Oba's organized resistance, Yamaguchi's group simply survived, existing in a state of limbo. In April 1947, nearly 2.5 years after Japan's surrender, a Japanese Navy admiral named Tadashi Nakamura traveled to Peleliu specifically to search for holdouts. Admiral Nakamura, who had commanded naval operations in the area during the war, believed that some Japanese soldiers might still be hiding on various Pacific islands. He led a small team through the jungles and cave systems of Peleliu, calling out in Japanese and leaving messages explaining that the war had ended and urging any survivors to come forward. Yamaguchi and his men heard these calls but remained suspicious. The voices could be American tricks, they reasoned, using Japanese prisoners to lure them out. However, Nakamura persisted, returning multiple times and even bringing letters from the families of known soldiers who had been stationed on Peleliu. Finally, after weeks of these efforts, Yamaguchi made contact. He met with Admiral Nakamura in a cave, demanding proof that Japan had truly surrendered, and that surrender would not mean execution or torture. Nakamura provided newspapers, photographs of Japan's surrender ceremony, and letters from Japanese government officials. He explained Japan's situation, the American occupation, and the rebuilding underway. Most importantly, he gave his word as a Japanese naval officer that the surrender was real and that the men would be treated honorably. Convinced at last, Yamaguchi led 33 soldiers and sailors out of hiding on April 22, 1947. Their emergence shocked both American authorities on Peleliu and officials in Japan. No one had expected so many survivors to still be hiding more than 2 years after the war's end. The men were emaciated, suffering from various diseases and injuries, but alive. They were repatriated to Japan within weeks, returning to a country that was struggling to rebuild but had moved far beyond the militarism that had sent them to war. Yamaguchi's case illustrates the importance of trust in convincing holdouts to surrender. It was not enough to simply announce the war's end. Holdouts needed credible proof from sources they could trust, preferably from Japanese military officers they respected. On Anatahan Island in the Northern Mariana Islands, a group of Japanese holdouts created one of the strangest and most tragic sagas of the post-war period. In June 1944, a group of 31 Japanese sailors and soldiers found themselves stranded on Anatahan after their ship was sunk by American forces. The island was tiny, volcanic, and isolated, but it had fresh water and enough vegetation to support survival. Also on the island were a Japanese woman named Kazuko Higa and her companion, both of whom had been working on the island before the war cut off their escape. For the next 6 years, this group of men and one woman lived on Anatahan in almost complete isolation from the outside world. They had no radio, no communication, and no way of knowing what was happening beyond their tiny island. They survived by fishing, collecting coconuts, and using salvaged equipment from wrecked ships that washed ashore. The presence of only one woman among 31 men created intense psychological and social tensions that erupted into violence. Over the 6 years, jealousy, rivalry, and conflict over Kazuko led to multiple murders within the group. Men killed each other in disputes, turning what should have been a survival situation into a dystopian nightmare. At least 12 men died from violence or under suspicious circumstances during the 6 years on Anatahan, though exact numbers remain unclear because accounts from survivors conflicted. The situation became known as the Queen Bee incident, with Kazuko portrayed in later sensationalized accounts as manipulating the men, though more nuanced analysis suggests she was more victim than villain, trapped in an impossible situation. The group knew the war had ended because in 1946, American aircraft dropped leaflets over the island announcing Japan's surrender and urging any Japanese personnel to signal for rescue. However, the group rejected these messages as tricks, though their reasons had less to do with military loyalty and more to do with internal dynamics and fear of the outside world. Finally, in June 1950, after 6 years on the island, the remaining survivors, now numbering 19, were convinced to leave. An American Navy vessel approached the island and communicated with the group using loudspeakers and Japanese translators. The promise of food, medical care, and return to Japan eventually overcame their resistance. The survivors boarded the American ship, leaving behind the graves of their comrades and the remnants of their makeshift village. When they returned to Japan, their story became a sensation, though a scandalous one. The violence, the jealousies, and the circumstances surrounding the deaths on Anatahan fascinated and horrified the Japanese public. The case was less about military honor and more about human nature under extreme stress, revealing how quickly civilization's veneer can crack when people are isolated and desperate. Kazuko Higa's story was particularly scrutinized, with some portraying her as a femme fatale and others as a woman forced into an impossible situation. She gave various interviews over the years, though accounts of what actually happened on Anatahan varied, colored by sensationalism and the passage of time. Another significant holdout was Lieutenant Fumio Nakahara, discovered on the island of Mindoro in the Philippines in 1980, 35 years after Japan's surrender. Nakahara's case differs from others because he was not found hiding in the jungle but living semi-openly among a remote indigenous community. In 1945, Nakahara had retreated into the mountains of Mindoro when American forces secured the island. Over time, he made contact with the Mangyan people, indigenous highlanders who had limited interaction with lowland Filipino society. Rather than living in total isolation, Nakahara integrated into the Mangyan community, though he kept his Japanese identity secret from outsiders. He married a Mangyan woman, had children, and lived as a farmer and hunter. He spoke the local language, participated in community life, and to external observers appeared to be a member of the tribe. For 35 years, Nakahara maintained this hidden existence. known only to the immediate community who protected his secret. His reasons for not coming forward were complex. Initially, fear of prosecution as a war criminal kept him hiding. As years passed, the fear became less about legal consequences and more about the life he had built. He had a family, responsibilities, and a place in the community. Leaving would mean abandoning all of that and returning to a Japan he no longer knew and that no longer knew him. His discovery in 1980 was accidental. A journalist investigating indigenous communities in Mindoro heard rumors of an old Japanese man living in the mountains and tracked him down. When confronted, Nakahara initially denied his identity, but the journalist persisted. Eventually, Nakahara confirmed he was a former Japanese soldier. News of his discovery spread, and Japanese officials contacted him, offering repatriation and assuring him he would face no prosecution. However, Nakahara declined to return to Japan. He stated that his life was now in the Philippines with his family and community. He had no desire to leave the only home he had known for decades. This decision shocked many in Japan who expected that any surviving soldier would eagerly return home. Nakahara's case challenged assumptions about national identity and belonging. He remained in the Philippines until his death in the mid-1990s, never returning to Japan, never seeking recognition or compensation. His story raises profound questions about what it means to belong to a nation. Can a person truly sever ties with their homeland, or do those connections persist regardless of time and distance? Nakahara seemed to suggest that belonging is created through daily life, relationships, and community, not through abstract notions of nationality. His children, half Japanese and half Mangyan, represented a bridge between worlds, embodying the complex legacies of war and colonialism. Nakahara's case also highlighted how some soldiers found peace not by returning to their old lives, but by building new ones entirely, letting go of the past and embracing a different future. The phenomenon of Japanese holdouts extended beyond individual soldiers to include entire groups who maintained organized resistance for extended periods. On Guam, even after Yokoi was discovered in 1972, reports continued of other possible holdouts in the jungle. Local Chamorro residents occasionally reported sightings of mysterious figures in remote areas, stolen food from farms, and other signs of human presence where none should be. Some of these reports proved to be false alarms or misidentifications, but others suggested that additional Japanese soldiers might still be hiding. In 1973, just a year after Yokoi's discovery, 2 more Japanese soldiers emerged from the jungle on Guam. Kiyoshi Morino and Kazuto Tomita surrendered to American authorities after living in hiding for 28 years. Unlike Yokoi, who had been alone for his final 8 years, Morino and Tomita had each other for companionship throughout their time in hiding. They had survived similarly to Yokoi, living in caves, gathering food from the jungle, and avoiding all contact with the outside world. Their emergence raised questions about whether they knew of Yokoi's presence on the island and whether the 3 men had ever encountered each other. Both Morino and Tomita stated they were aware of rumors of other Japanese holdouts but had never made contact, fearing that any such meeting could compromise their security. The irony is striking. 3 men hiding on the same island, enduring the same hardships, sharing the same nationality and circumstances, yet remaining isolated from each other out of fear and suspicion. If they had joined forces, their survival might have been easier, their psychological burden lighter, but the training and paranoia that kept them alive also kept them apart. Morino and Tomita were repatriated to Japan where, like Yokoi and Onoda before them, they struggled to adjust to a radically different society. Both men had spent their entire adult lives in hiding, missing marriages, families, careers, and the opportunity to contribute to Japan's post-war recovery. They received pensions from the government and lived quietly, rarely speaking about their experiences to the media. The psychological impact of decades in hiding affected all holdouts, but manifested differently in each case. Some, like Onoda, remained defiant and proud of their service, viewing their holdout period as evidence of their superior discipline and commitment. Others, like Yokoi, struggled with shame and a sense of having wasted their lives. Still others, like Nakamura, seemed broken by the experience, unable to fully communicate what they had endured or to reconnect with society in meaningful ways. Mental health professionals who examined various holdouts noted common patterns: difficulty with trust, hypervigilance even in safe environments, a sense of time having stopped in 1945, and profound difficulty accepting that the world had moved on without them. Many holdouts described feeling like ghosts, visiting a world that no longer had a place for them. The Japan they returned to bore almost no resemblance to the Japan they remembered, making reintegration nearly impossible. One particularly haunting case involved Private Teruo Yoshida, who died alone in the jungles of Morotai Island in 1977, just 3 years after Teruo Nakamura's discovery on the same island. Indonesian authorities found Yoshida's body in a remote area, along with evidence he had been living there for decades. His skeleton, identified through dental records and personal effects, revealed he had survived alone for more than 30 years, dying of unknown causes sometime in 1977. Unlike Nakamura, who had been rescued and returned to civilization, Yoshida died, never knowing the war had ended, never receiving help, never going home. The discovery of his remains shocked both Indonesian and Japanese authorities. If 2 men had survived on Morotai for 3 decades, how many others might still be hiding on remote islands across the Pacific and Southeast Asia? This question prompted renewed search efforts in the mid to late 1970s, with Japanese and local governments conducting surveys of remote areas where Japanese garrisons had been stationed. These searches discovered evidence of other holdouts, some long dead and others who had integrated into local communities, as Nakahara had done. The broader context of these holdout cases reveals important truths about the final years of the Pacific War and its aftermath. Japanese military training emphasized absolute obedience to orders, loyalty to the emperor above all else, and the unacceptability of surrender. Soldiers were taught that death was preferable to the shame of capture, and many believed that surrender meant torture and execution by Allied forces. These beliefs were reinforced through propaganda and through stories, some true and many exaggerated, of Allied brutality toward prisoners. When Japanese soldiers found themselves cut off and facing defeat, many chose suicide or final suicidal attacks rather than surrender. Those who chose to hide instead represented a third option, neither fighting to the death nor surrendering, but continuing to resist in the only way available to them. This option required extraordinary mental resilience and a willingness to endure years, even decades of hardship, isolation, and deprivation. The training at institutions like the Nakano School, where Onoda was educated, specifically prepared officers for long-term guerrilla operations and survival behind enemy lines. Students learned not just military tactics, but also psychological techniques for maintaining morale and commitment during extended isolation. They were trained to doubt everything, to assume that any news of Japanese defeat was enemy propaganda, and to wait for direct orders from legitimate Japanese authority before surrendering. This training proved devastatingly effective, creating soldiers who could maintain their mission for decades despite overwhelming evidence that the war had ended. In Onoda's case, he only surrendered when his original commanding officer, Major Taniguchi, personally delivered the order. No amount of leaflets, newspapers, or appeals from family could override the original order he received in 1944. This demonstrates both the power of military indoctrination and its terrible cost. The question of why it took so long to convince holdouts to surrender has multiple answers. First, the breakdown of communications in the final months of the war meant that many island garrisons never received official notification of the surrender. They simply found themselves cut off, with all communication from Japan ceasing. Second, Allied forces and later Japanese search teams underestimated how deeply the no-surrender ideology had been ingrained in these soldiers. Early attempts to bring holdouts in focused on announcing the war's end through leaflets and loudspeakers, assuming that soldiers would accept this information and emerge. These attempts failed to account for the intense training and indoctrination that had prepared soldiers to reject exactly this type of message as enemy deception. Third, the remote locations where many holdouts lived made systematic searches difficult and expensive. Islands like Lubang, Morotai, and others had vast areas of dense jungle, mountainous terrain, and cave systems where individuals or small groups could hide almost indefinitely. Fourth, some local populations, whether Filipino, Indonesian, or otherwise, were ambivalent about helping find Japanese holdouts. The Japanese occupation had been brutal in many areas, marked by atrocities, forced labor, and widespread suffering, Local people had little motivation to help former occupiers, and in some cases, actively concealed their presence either out of fear or a desire to see them suffer. Fifth, the chaos of the post-war period meant that searching for holdouts was not a high priority for either Allied occupation authorities or the struggling Japanese government. Japan was devastated, occupied, and focused on survival and reconstruction. The fate of scattered soldiers hiding on remote islands seemed less urgent than feeding millions of citizens, rebuilding infrastructure, and navigating the American occupation. Only in the 1950s, as Japan began to recover economically and politically, did organized efforts to locate and repatriate holdouts begin in earnest. The efforts to bring holdouts home involved cooperation between Japanese authorities, the governments of countries where holdouts were located, and often the families of the missing soldiers. Japanese veterans organizations played a crucial role, funding expeditions and providing volunteers who would search remote areas. These searches often faced danger, difficult conditions, and frequent failures. Many expeditions returned empty-handed, finding only evidence that holdouts had been in an area, but not the holdouts themselves. The psychological approach to reaching holdouts evolved over time. Early efforts relied on simple announcements and promises of safety. When these failed, searchers began bringing proof of Japan's surrender: newspapers, photographs, recordings of the emperor's surrender speech, and letters from families. However, even these were often dismissed as elaborate forgeries. The breakthrough came when searchers realized that holdouts needed to hear from sources they considered absolutely credible, usually former commanding officers or respected military figures. This approach succeeded with Captain Oba, Lieutenant Yamaguchi, and eventually with Hiroo Onoda, demonstrating that reaching holdouts required understanding their worldview and addressing their specific concerns about honor, duty, and trust. The broader implications of the holdout phenomenon extended far beyond the individual stories of survival and discovery. The existence of soldiers fighting a war that had ended decades earlier raised fundamental questions about military training, command structure, and the ethics of absolute obedience. In the immediate post-war period, the existence of holdouts was seen primarily as a practical problem to be solved through search operations and rescue missions. However, as time passed and more cases came to light, particularly the extended holdouts lasting into the 1970s, scholars and military analysts began to examine the phenomenon more critically, asking deeper questions about what had created these situations and what lessons could be learned from them. The imperial Japanese military system that produced holdouts was built on principles that dated back centuries, rooted in samurai traditions of loyalty, honor, and service unto death. These traditional values were adapted and intensified during Japan's rapid militarization in the 1920s and 1930s, creating a military culture that demanded absolute obedience and portrayed surrender as the ultimate shame. The training programs at institutions like the Nakano School represented the pinnacle of this philosophy, creating officers who were essentially programmed to continue fighting indefinitely, regardless of circumstances. The curriculum at the Nakano School was highly classified and intensive, covering not just military tactics but also intelligence gathering, code breaking, languages, local customs of occupied territories, and crucially, psychological preparation for long-term isolation and guerrilla warfare. Students learned to distrust everything except direct orders from verified Japanese military authority. They were taught techniques for resisting interrogation, methods for verifying the authenticity of documents and messages, and strategies for maintaining morale and commitment during extended periods without contact with command. The training was remarkably effective at creating soldiers who could operate independently for years, but it failed to include any provision for how such operations should end, or how officers should verify when circumstances had fundamentally changed. This oversight, whether intentional or simply unconsidered, created the conditions for the holdout phenomenon. The comparison between Japanese holdouts and soldiers from other nations who found themselves in similar circumstances is illuminating. There were cases of German soldiers in remote areas of the Soviet Union who avoided capture for months or even a few years after the war ended, but none persisted for decades as Japanese holdouts did. Similarly, while there were occasional reports of Italian or other Axis soldiers hiding for extended periods, these cases were rare and brief compared to the Japanese experience. What made Japanese holdouts unique was the combination of several factors: The geographic isolation of Pacific Islands that made discovery difficult, the intense training and indoctrination that made soldiers psychologically prepared for long-term isolation, the cultural values that made surrender unthinkable, and the breakdown of communications at the end of the war that left many garrisons without clear orders. Allied soldiers, while certainly capable of survival and evasion, generally did not face the same cultural barriers to surrender and were more willing to accept changed circumstances when presented with credible evidence. The impact of Japanese holdouts on post-war Japanese society was significant and multifaceted. In the immediate post-war period, when Japan was occupied by American forces and struggling to rebuild from devastating defeat, the existence of soldiers still fighting seemed like a painful reminder of the war and its costs. However, as Japan began to recover economically in the 1950s and 1960s, attitudes toward holdouts began to shift. Some saw them as embarrassing relics of a militaristic past that Japan was trying to move beyond. Others began to view them with a mixture of sympathy and admiration, seeing in their endurance and commitment an echo of traditional Japanese values that seemed to be fading in the rush to modernize. This tension between shame and pride, between wanting to forget the war and wanting to honor sacrifice, has characterized Japanese attitudes toward holdouts throughout the post-war period. The discovery of each new holdout reignited these debates, forcing Japanese society to confront questions about national identity, the meaning of loyalty, and how to remember a complex and painful history. The media coverage of holdouts evolved dramatically over the decades. When Captain Oba surrendered in 1945 and other early holdouts emerged in the late 1940s and early 1950s, media coverage was relatively straightforward and factual, focusing on the circumstances of their survival and their return home. However, by the 1970s, when Yokoi and Onoda were discovered, media coverage had become much more sensationalized and complex. Television news programs featured extensive interviews with the returned soldiers. Documentaries examined their survival techniques in detail, and opinion pieces debated the meaning and significance of their experiences. Yokoi's humble demeanor and his famous statement about returning with embarrassment resonated differently than Onoda's proud bearing and defiant attitude. The media portrayed them in contrasting ways, with Yokoi often depicted as a victim of circumstances and Onoda as a warrior who had never truly surrendered. These differing portrayals reflected broader societal debates about how to understand the war and its legacy. The economic impact of searching for and repatriating holdouts was substantial, though difficult to quantify precisely. The Japanese government funded numerous expeditions to remote islands and jungle areas, employed translators and negotiators, and provided medical care and pensions to returned soldiers. Local governments in the Philippines, Indonesia, and other countries where holdouts were found also bore costs related to search operations and dealing with holdouts who had committed crimes during their time in hiding. Veterans. Organizations in Japan, some funded by government grants and others through private donations, organized their own search missions and support programs for returned holdouts and their families. These organizations often included former military officers who felt a personal obligation to bring home surviving comrades. The total expenditure on holdout-related activities over several decades likely ran into millions of dollars, though whether this represented money well spent or wasted on quixotic missions depends on one's perspective. For families who were reunited with loved ones thought dead, no cost would be too high. For taxpayers footing the bill for searches that yielded no results, or for supporting men who had hidden rather than contribute to society, the expense might seem unjustified. The legal and ethical questions raised by holdouts proved thorny and often went unresolved. From a legal standpoint, holdouts occupied a grey area. They were not deserters, as they hadn't left. Their assigned positions with intent to abandon their duties. Rather, they had followed orders to continue fighting and had simply never received orders to stop. They were not prisoners of war, as they had never been captured by enemy forces. They were not war criminals in the traditional sense, though some had committed acts that would be considered crimes if committed by civilians. The resolution of these legal ambiguities varied by case and by the jurisdiction where holdouts were found. In most cases, pragmatism won out over strict legal interpretation. Holdouts were pardoned for actions committed while believing they were in active combat, repatriated to Japan, and treated as veterans rather than criminals or deserters. However, this lenient treatment was not universal and depended heavily on local circumstances, political considerations, and public opinion in both Japan and the countries where holdouts were found. Ethically, the question of responsibility for the holdout phenomenon raises difficult issues. To what extent were individual soldiers responsible for choosing to hide for decades rather than accepting reality? To what extent was the Imperial Japanese military responsible for training soldiers so thoroughly in rejection of surrender that they could not accept changed circumstances? To what extent were Allied forces and later the Japanese government responsible for failing to ensure that all soldiers were notified of the war's end? These questions of responsibility and blame have no simple answers. Individual soldiers made choices, certainly, but those choices were heavily influenced by training, culture, and circumstances beyond their control. The military created a system that valued absolute obedience over critical thinking, which had both intended effects in creating determined fighters and unintended consequences in creating soldiers who could not stop fighting when the war ended. Allied forces and the post-war Japanese government made efforts to locate and notify holdouts, but these efforts were imperfect and often came too late. The ethical responsibility is thus distributed across multiple actors and institutions, making simple judgments of right and wrong difficult. The psychological research conducted on returned holdouts provided valuable insights into extreme human behavior under stress. Psychiatrists and psychologists who examined holdouts noted several consistent patterns. First, nearly all holdouts described a phenomenon of time distortion, where individual days blended together and the passage of years seemed both incredibly slow in the moment and shockingly fast in retrospect. This temporal distortion is common in situations of extreme monotony and isolation, where the lack of novel experiences makes it difficult for the brain to form distinct memories, causing time to seem to pass differently than it does in normal life. Second, holdouts demonstrated remarkable compartmentalization, an ability to separate their immediate reality from broader questions about meaning and purpose. To survive psychologically, they focused on daily tasks and immediate goals, rather than dwelling on the bigger picture of their situation. This coping mechanism allowed them to function but also prevented them from critically examining their circumstances. Third, many holdouts showed symptoms consistent with what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, though the full understanding and diagnosis of PTSD was still developing during the 1970s when most holdouts emerged. Symptoms included hypervigilance, difficulty sleeping, emotional numbing, intrusive memories, and exaggerated startle responses. However, the PTSD experienced by holdouts differed in some ways from combat-related PTSD studied in other populations. While combat veterans typically suffered from traumatic memories of specific violent events, holdouts' trauma seemed more related to the cumulative effect of years of isolation, deprivation, and constant vigilance rather than to specific traumatic incidents. This distinction highlighted the fact that psychological trauma can result not just from acute events, but also from chronic stress and deprivation over extended periods. Fourth, returned holdouts demonstrated what psychologists termed learned helplessness in some areas while showing remarkable self-efficacy in others. They were highly competent at survival tasks and maintaining discipline, but often felt helpless when faced with modern technology, social interactions, or decisions about their futures. This split between areas of competence and incompetence made reintegration particularly challenging. The families of holdouts often required psychological support as well. The sudden reappearance of a family member thought dead for decades created what psychologists call ambiguous loss in reverse. Typically, ambiguous loss refers to losing someone whose fate is unknown, creating unresolved grief. In the case of holdouts, families experience the opposite, the return of someone whose death they had accepted and grieved, forcing them to ungrieve while simultaneously adjusting to the reality that the person who returned was not the person they remembered. This psychological challenge affected different family members in different ways. Parents of holdouts, if still alive, often expressed overwhelming joy at their child's return, though that joy was tempered by sadness for the lost years and worry about their child's well-being. Siblings had complex feelings, mixing happiness at reunion with resentment at the attention and resources devoted to the returned holdout. While they had struggled through the post-war period, wives faced the most difficult situations, especially if they had remarried. The return of a husband thought dead created impossible choices and painful conflicts between past and present loyalties. Children who learned that their father was alive after believing him dead struggled to form relationships with a stranger who claimed parental authority. These family dynamics were often not resolved successfully, with many relationships remaining strained or distant despite everyone's best efforts. The question of how holdouts viewed themselves evolved over time and varied significantly between individuals. Immediately upon discovery, most holdouts seem to have viewed themselves as soldiers still performing their duties, as Onoda demonstrated when he formally presented his sword and rifle to Philippine President Marcos. Many maintained military bearing and discipline even in the moment of surrender, viewing themselves as soldiers returning from a completed mission rather than as fugitives being captured. However, as time passed and holdouts attempted to reintegrate into society, their self-conception often shifted. Some, like Onoda, continued to view their holdout period with pride, seeing it as evidence of superior discipline and commitment. Others, like Yokoi, came to view themselves more as victims or survivors, emphasizing the hardship and suffering they endured, rather than the nobility of their continued resistance. Still others struggled to make sense of their experiences at all, unable to reconcile the person they had been during their holdout period with the person they became afterward. These shifts in self-conception often occurred multiple times over years or decades, as holdouts continued to process their experiences, and their reintegration into society proceeded with varying degrees of success. The impact of modern technology on the holdout phenomenon is worth considering, as it helps explain why such cases are unlikely to occur in future conflicts. The holdouts of World War II existed in an era when communications technology was relatively primitive. Radio communication was the primary means of long-distance communication, and many island garrisons had limited or no radio equipment. When supply lines were cut and forces isolated, they truly had no way of receiving information about events beyond their immediate area. In contrast, modern military forces have access to satellite communications, GPS navigation, encrypted digital communications, and numerous redundant systems for maintaining contact with command. The likelihood of soldiers being genuinely cut off from all communication with their command structure for extended periods is vastly reduced. Additionally, modern intelligence capabilities, including satellite imagery, drone surveillance, and electronic monitoring, make it much more difficult for individuals or small groups to hide for extended periods. If a group of soldiers attempted to hide in a remote area today, they would likely be detected through heat signatures, electronic emissions from any devices they used, or satellite surveillance far more quickly than the holdouts of World War II, who could remain hidden for decades. Furthermore, modern military training, while still emphasizing discipline and commitment, also emphasizes critical thinking, rules of engagement, and clear chains of command with provisions for changing circumstances. Modern soldiers are trained to verify orders, assess situations, and make informed decisions rather than simply follow orders without question. This represents a significant shift from the absolute obedience model that characterized Imperial Japanese military training and that contributed to the holdout phenomenon. While modern militaries certainly value discipline and following orders, they also recognize that battlefield conditions are complex and that soldiers need to be able to adapt to changing circumstances, including knowing when and how to cease combat operations. The lessons learned from Japanese holdouts and similar cases have influenced modern military doctrine, leading to clearer protocols for ending conflicts, better communication systems, and training that emphasizes both commitment and flexibility. The representation of holdouts in popular culture has been extensive and varied, reflecting different cultural perspectives and historical moments. In Japan, holdouts have been portrayed in numerous films, television dramas, books, and manga. Some of these portrayals have been relatively accurate and sympathetic, attempting to understand the psychological and historical factors that created holdouts. Others have been more sensationalized or romanticized, emphasizing adventure and survival while downplaying the tragedy and waste involved. The 1974 film about Shoichi Yokoi's experience portrayed him sympathetically as a victim of circumstances trying to survive and maintain his honor. More recent works have taken more critical perspectives, questioning the value system that created holdouts and examining the darker aspects of military indoctrination. Internationally, holdouts have fascinated filmmakers and writers as well, with Western portrayals often emphasizing the exotic or bizarre aspects of the phenomenon while sometimes missing the deeper cultural and historical context. The 2021 film Onoda, 10,000 Nights in the Jungle, directed by Arthur Harari, attempted a more nuanced portrayal, examining both Onoda's remarkable endurance and the tragedy of his situation. Literary treatments of holdouts have ranged from straightforward autobiographies written by the holdouts themselves to fictionalized accounts inspired by real cases. Hiroo Onoda's autobiography, No Surrender, My 30-Year War, remains the most detailed first-person account of the holdout experience, providing invaluable insight into his thinking and motivations. However, the book has also been criticized for its lack of remorse regarding the casualties caused during his holdout period, and for its romanticization of military values that many feel should be questioned rather than celebrated. Shoichi Yokoi also wrote about his experiences, though his accounts tended to emphasize the hardship and loneliness rather than pride in his service. Fictional works inspired by holdouts have explored various themes: the nature of reality and belief, the cost of absolute commitment, the difficulty of accepting change, and the tension between individual judgment and obedience to authority. These literary explorations have helped keep the holdout phenomenon alive in public consciousness and have contributed to ongoing debates about its meaning and significance. The educational use of holdout stories in teaching about World War II and its aftermath has been substantial. In Japanese schools, the topic of holdouts is often included in history curricula as part of teaching about the war's end and post-war period, though the interpretation and emphasis vary depending on the educational philosophy of particular schools and teachers. Some approaches emphasize the holdouts' endurance and survival skills, using their stories to teach about human resilience. Others use holdout cases to critically examine military indoctrination and the dangers of absolute obedience. Still others focus on the human cost of war and the difficulty of reintegration for veterans. Internationally, holdout stories are sometimes used in military history courses, courses on Asian history, or courses on psychology and human behavior. The stories provide concrete examples for discussing abstract concepts like cognitive dissonance, indoctrination, isolation, and cultural values. The educational value of holdout stories lies partly in their dramatic nature, which captures student interest, and partly in their complexity, which resists simple interpretation and encourages critical thinking. The relationship between Japanese holdouts and other historical cases of soldiers or civilians who continued fighting or resisting after conflicts officially ended provides useful comparative context. Throughout history, there have been cases of resistance movements that continued after formal surrenders or peace treaties. However, the Japanese holdout phenomenon differs in significant ways from these other cases. Resistance movements typically have political goals, local support, and some form of organization and communication. Japanese holdouts, in contrast, were isolated individuals or small groups without political goals beyond waiting for orders, without local support and often in active conflict with local populations, and without organization or communication with any larger movement. They were not guerrilla fighters in the traditional sense, but rather soldiers frozen in time, continuing to perform obsolete missions. This distinction is important because it highlights that holdouts were not making political or strategic decisions to continue resistance, but rather were psychologically unable to accept that the war had ended. This makes them different from, for example, Baltic resistance fighters who continued guerrilla warfare against Soviet occupation into the 1950s, or various colonial independence movements that fought on after supposed peace agreements. Those groups made conscious strategic decisions to continue fighting based on political goals. Japanese holdouts continued fighting largely because they could not psychologically process the possibility that surrender had occurred. Another point of comparison is with castaways or shipwreck survivors who have spent extended periods isolated before rescue. Like holdouts, Castaways must survive in difficult environments with limited resources, endure psychological stress from isolation, and eventually reintegrate into society after years away. However, castaways typically want to be rescued and actively seek to attract attention, whereas holdouts actively avoided detection. Castaways maintain hope of rescue and return to normalcy, while holdouts often believed that rescue meant capture and shame. The psychological profiles are therefore quite different, though some survival skills and coping mechanisms may be similar. The comparison highlights that what made the holdout experience unique was not just the physical survival challenges, but the psychological framework within which they occurred, the belief that they were still soldiers performing duties rather than unfortunate victims of circumstances waiting for rescue. The question of what should be done with the artifacts, writings, and historical materials left by holdouts has generated some debate. Onoda's rifle, sword, and other equipment were preserved and displayed in museums, both in Japan and the Philippines. His writings and interviews have been archived and studied by historians. Similarly, Yokoi's woven clothing and the artifacts from his cave hideout are preserved as examples of survival ingenuity. However, some critics argue that displaying these items glorifies military values and the holdout phenomenon in ways that are inappropriate. They suggest that while the historical significance should be acknowledged, the display should be accompanied by critical context that addresses the tragedy and waste involved, rather than simply celebrating survival and endurance. This debate reflects broader tensions in Japan and other countries about how to remember military history and what lessons should be drawn from it. Museums and historical societies have generally attempted to strike a balance, preserving artifacts for their historical value, while providing educational context that encourages visitors to think critically about what the artifacts represent. The final years of the last surviving holdouts were marked by a mix of continued struggle with their pasts and gradual coming to terms with their experiences. Hiroo Onoda, who lived until 2014, remained active in his later years, running his nature school and giving occasional lectures. He maintained to the end that he had no regrets about his actions, and that he had simply done his duty as ordered. However, those who knew him well reported that in private moments he sometimes expressed sadness about the years lost and the life not lived. Shoichi Yokoi, who died in 1997, seemed more openly troubled by his experience, frequently expressing that he felt he had wasted his life and contributed nothing to Japan's recovery. His later years were marked by increasing isolation and depression, suggesting that the psychological wounds of his holdout period never fully healed. Other holdouts who survived their return to civilization showed similar patterns, with most struggling to find peace with their experiences, despite outward appearances of adjustment. The universal nature of this struggle suggests that the trauma of being a holdout was deep and lasting, affecting individuals for the remainder of their lives, regardless of how they chose to frame or interpret their experiences publicly. The commemoration and memorialization of Japanese holdouts has taken various forms in Japan and in the countries where they spent decades in hiding. In Japan, some municipalities where holdouts were born have created small memorials or museum exhibits documenting their lives and experiences. These memorials typically present the holdouts as examples of perseverance and dedication, though more recent exhibitions have begun to include more critical perspectives that question whether such extreme commitment represented virtue or tragic inflexibility. In the Philippines, particularly on Lubang Island where Onoda spent 29 years, there are mixed feelings about memorialization. Some locals have created informal museums or tour businesses based on the Onoda story, recognizing the tourist interest in the locations where he hid. However, families of Filipinos killed during Onoda's holdout period have expressed discomfort with what they see as the glorification of a man whose actions caused real harm to their community. This tension between historical interest and painful memory illustrates the ongoing challenges of how to remember and teach about the holdout phenomenon in ways that acknowledge multiple perspectives and the complexity of the legacy. The role of international organizations and diplomatic efforts in resolving holdout situations was significant and often underappreciated. The International Red Cross played an important role in facilitating communication between the Japanese government and the governments of countries where holdouts were discovered, helping to ensure that returned soldiers were treated humanely and repatriated safely. Various United Nations agencies were involved in some cases, particularly when holdouts were discovered in newly independent nations that lacked diplomatic relations with Japan. Private citizens and organizations, including religious groups and humanitarian organizations, sometimes intervened to help negotiate the surrender of holdouts or to provide support for returned soldiers and their families. These international efforts demonstrated that the holdout phenomenon was not just a Japanese problem or a problem for the countries where holdouts were found, but a humanitarian issue that required international cooperation and coordination. The successful resolution of most holdout cases without violence or additional tragedy owed much to this international cooperation, which helped overcome political, cultural, and practical barriers that might otherwise have prevented peaceful outcomes. The theoretical frameworks developed by scholars to understand the holdout phenomenon have drawn on multiple disciplines, including history, psychology, anthropology, sociology, and military science. Historians have examined the specific circumstances of the Pacific War's end, the breakdown of Japanese command structures, and the geographic and logistical challenges that made some soldiers effectively unreachable by news of surrender. Psychologists have studied the mental processes that allowed holdouts to maintain beliefs contradicted by evidence, exploring concepts like cognitive dissonance, confirmation bias, and the power of initial indoctrination to shape perception and interpretation of subsequent information. Anthropologists have analyzed the cultural values and social structures that created a military system capable of producing holdouts, examining how traditional Japanese concepts of honor, loyalty, and shame were mobilized and intensified for military purposes. Sociologists have studied the reintegration challenges faced by holdouts and the societal responses to their return, examining how societies deal with individuals who have been absent during periods of rapid change. Military scientists have examined the tactical and strategic implications of creating soldiers so committed to their missions that they continue fighting beyond any reasonable stopping point, weighing the benefits of such commitment against the costs. This multidisciplinary scholarship has produced a rich understanding of the holdout phenomenon that goes far beyond simple narratives of survival or stubbornness, revealing it as a complex intersection of historical circumstances, psychological processes, cultural values, and individual choices. The discovery and surrender of holdouts continued sporadically throughout the 1970s and even into the 1980s. Each case brought renewed media attention and renewed questions about how many more soldiers might still be hiding. In the Philippines alone, reports of possible holdouts continued for decades. Local residents in remote areas of islands like Mindanao, Negros, and others occasionally reported encounters with individuals they believed to be Japanese soldiers. Some of these reports proved accurate, leading to the discovery of men who had been living in hiding for 30 or even 40 years. Other reports turned out to be cases of mistaken identity, Japanese civilians who had stayed in the Philippines after the war, or simply false sightings driven by local legends and folklore about Japanese ghosts or spirits, haunting the jungles. One verified case from the Philippines involved Private First Class Nakamura Masashi, not to be confused with Teruo Nakamura from Indonesia. This Nakamura was discovered in 1975 on the island of Mindanao, having lived in hiding for 30 years in the mountainous interior. Unlike other holdouts who maintained military discipline and a sense of mission, Nakamura had essentially gone native, living with an indigenous group and adopting their lifestyle while keeping his Japanese identity secret from outsiders. When discovered by Philippine authorities conducting a census in a remote village, Nakamura initially claimed to be a local tribesman. Only when confronted with evidence, including his still recognizable Japanese features and his inability to properly speak the local dialect, despite supposedly having lived there his whole life, did he admit his true identity. His case highlighted how some former soldiers had found ways to survive by integrating into local societies rather than living in complete isolation. These men often had complex motivations for not coming forward. Beyond fear of prosecution, they had built new lives, often with wives and children, and had reasons to remain hidden that had nothing to do with continued loyalty to Japan or belief that the war continued. Another remarkable case emerged from the dense jungles of New Guinea, where Japanese forces had fought desperate battles against Australian and American troops. In 1976, local villagers in Papua New Guinea reported encountering an elderly Japanese man living alone in a remote area. The man spoke only Japanese, appeared disoriented, and fled when approached. Papua New Guinea authorities, working with Japanese diplomats, organized a search. After several weeks, they located the man, who turned out to be a former Japanese soldier named Nakamura Kimi. He had been hiding since 1945, believing the war still continued and that Japanese forces would eventually return. Unlike holdouts in the Philippines or Indonesia, Nakamura in New Guinea had lived in almost complete isolation, with minimal contact even with local populations. The jungle had been his prison and his fortress, protecting him from discovery, but also condemning him to 3 decades of loneliness. When brought back to civilization, Nakamura was in poor physical and mental health. He was suffering from malnutrition, various tropical diseases, and showed signs of significant psychological trauma. His speech was confused, mixing Japanese with sounds and words that seemed to have no meaning, possibly a private language he had developed during his isolation. He could not initially comprehend that he was safe, that the war had ended, or that he was being helped rather than captured by enemies. Medical professionals who examined him noted that his condition resembled severe cases of solitary confinement trauma. The complete lack of human interaction for decades had damaged his ability to communicate and relate to others. After several months of medical treatment and psychological counseling, Nakamura improved somewhat, but he never fully recovered. He was repatriated to Japan, where he lived in a care facility until his death in 1979. His case demonstrated that while physical survival in the jungle was possible, the psychological cost of extreme isolation could be devastating and, in some cases, permanent. The holdout phenomenon was not limited to the Pacific Theater. In China, particularly in Manchuria and other regions where large Japanese garrisons had been stationed, reports of Japanese holdouts persisted into the 1970s. However, verifying these reports was complicated by the political situation in China. The Chinese Civil War, followed by the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949, and subsequent political upheavals, including the Cultural Revolution, made systematic searching for Japanese holdouts impossible. Some former Japanese soldiers who had been captured by Chinese communist forces were held as prisoners for years after the war's end, only being released and repatriated in the 1950s under political agreements between Japan and China. Others, fearing persecution or unable to return home due to the breakdown in diplomatic relations, integrated into Chinese society, hiding their Japanese identities and living as Chinese citizens. Several cases emerged in the 1980s of elderly men in rural China being discovered to be former Japanese soldiers who had lived under false identities for 40 years. One such case involved a man known locally as Jiang Wei, who was discovered in 1983 in a remote village in Heilongjiang province to actually be Tanaka Masao, a former Japanese soldier. Tanaka had been part of the Kwantung Army, the large Japanese force stationed in Manchuria. When Soviet forces invaded Manchuria in August 1945, the Kwantung Army collapsed rapidly. Many soldiers were captured and sent to labor camps in Siberia, but Tanaka managed to escape and went into hiding in rural China. Fearing that revelation of his Japanese identity would lead to execution or imprisonment, he obtained false identity papers, claimed to be an orphan Chinese man displaced by the war, and settled in a village where he worked as a farmer. Over the decades, he married a local woman, had children, and lived a seemingly normal life. His Japanese identity was his deepest secret, shared with no one, not even his wife. In the early 1980s, as China began opening up and relations with Japan improved, Tanaka's conscience and a desire to see his homeland before death led him to contact Japanese authorities and reveal his true identity. His case, and others like it, highlighted how former soldiers sometimes hid, not in jungles, but in plain sight, concealing their identities and pasts to avoid persecution. The psychological profiles of holdouts reveal common patterns, but also significant individual variations. All holdouts experienced extreme stress, isolation, and the challenge of maintaining hope and purpose in desperate circumstances. However, their responses to these challenges differed based on personality, training, circumstances, and the length of their isolation. Those who maintained a sense of mission, like Onoda, seemed to cope better psychologically than those who lost their purpose and simply existed day to day. Having a clear objective, even if based on false premises, provided structure and meaning that helped preserve mental health. Conversely, Those who recognized that the war had ended but continued hiding out of fear or shame often suffered greater psychological damage, trapped between the desire to return home and the terror of facing consequences or judgment. Research conducted by Japanese psychologists who studied returned holdouts identified several common symptoms of what might be termed holdout syndrome. These included chronic hypervigilance, difficulty trusting others, profound sense of temporal dislocation, survivor's guilt, and in many cases, a feeling of having wasted their lives. Many holdouts describe their years in hiding as having passed in a blur, with individual days blending together into an endless sameness. Upon return, they often struggled with the concept that decades had passed. Time, which had seemed suspended in the jungle, suddenly accelerated, confronting them with aging family members, technological changes, and a society that had moved through multiple generations of development while they remained frozen in 1945. This temporal disconnect created profound alienation. Holdouts felt like time travelers, displaced persons who belonged neither to their past nor to the present they found themselves in. The impact on families of holdouts was equally significant and often overlooked. When soldiers went missing in action during the war, their families faced uncertainty. Were their sons, husbands, or fathers dead or merely captured? For years, families clung to hope, but as time passed, most accepted that their loved ones had perished. Memorial services were held, names were added to war memorials, and families grieved and moved on. When a holdout then emerged decades later, families experienced a complex mixture of emotions: joy at their survival, grief for the lost decades, anger at the suffering caused by their absence, and confusion about how to relate to someone who was essentially a stranger. The returning soldier often resembled their family member, only superficially. The young man who had left in 1944 was now an old man, traumatized and changed by decades of hardship. Communication was difficult. The holdout and their family had lived completely different lives, developed different values, and had no shared experiences for 30 years. Relationships had to be rebuilt from scratch if they could be rebuilt at all. Several wives of holdouts who had been told their husbands were dead had remarried and built new lives. When their supposedly dead husbands suddenly reappeared, legal and emotional complications arose. Japanese law, like most legal systems, had provisions for declaring missing persons legally dead after a certain period. Wives who had remarried were legally married to their second husbands, making the return of the first husband a legal grey area. In most cases, these situations were resolved by the returned holdout, accepting that their wife had moved on and not attempting to re-establish the marriage. However, the emotional toll was significant. Imagine being told your husband died in 1945, grieving, eventually remarrying, having children with your second husband, building a life over 30 years, and then having your first husband appear still alive. The impossibility of such situations underscores how thoroughly the holdouts had been left behind by time and history. Children of holdouts face their own challenges. Some, like the children of Fumio Nakahara in the Philippines, grew up knowing their father's secret identity and carrying that burden. Others learned only later in life that their father had been a holdout, discovering a hidden past that recontextualized their entire understanding of their parent. For children in Japan whose fathers returned after decades missing, the appearance of a stranger claiming to be their father was often more disturbing than joyful. These children had grown up without fathers, often in poverty, because widows of soldiers received minimal support. The sudden appearance of a father figure after 30 years could not undo decades of absence, and many relationships between returned holdouts and their children remained strained or non-existent. The Japanese government struggled with how to handle holdouts from both a legal and a financial perspective. Legally, holdouts had not deserted or violated military law. They had simply followed their last orders and had not received notice of the war's end. Therefore, they could not be prosecuted under military law. However, they also could not be considered prisoners of war or victims of war crimes, as they had hidden voluntarily. The government eventually settled on providing modest pensions and recognition of service, treating holdouts as veterans who had served unusually long tours of duty under extraordinary circumstances. However, this approach satisfied no one completely. Some felt that holdouts deserved greater compensation and recognition for their suffering and sacrifice. Others felt that holdouts had wasted resources and should not be rewarded for stubbornly refusing to accept reality. The debate reflected broader tensions in Japanese society about how to remember the war and how to balance honoring sacrifice with acknowledging the tragedy and waste of the conflict. Internationally, the discovery of holdouts prompted varied responses. In countries like the Philippines and Indonesia, where Japanese occupation had been brutal, local populations often had little sympathy for holdouts, viewing them as remnants of an oppressive military machine that had caused tremendous suffering. The fact that some holdouts had killed local civilians during their time in hiding, even if they believed they were still fighting a war, created resentment and calls for prosecution. However, most governments opted for leniency, recognizing that prosecuting elderly men for crimes committed, while under the sincere belief that they were still in active combat, raised complex legal and moral questions. In most cases, holdouts were pardoned, deported to Japan, and left to deal with their personal demons without facing criminal justice. The final known Japanese holdout to be discovered was Private Teruo Nakamura in 1974, though reports of possible sightings and rumors continued for decades afterward. By the 1980s, most experts believed that any remaining holdouts had either died in hiding or had so thoroughly integrated into local populations that they would never be discovered. However, stories persisted. In the Philippines, local legends spoke of Japanese ghosts in the mountains, spirits of soldiers who died without returning home. Some of these tales might have been based on real encounters with holdouts or their remains. In remote areas of Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and other regions where Japanese forces had been stationed, occasional reports surfaced of mysterious hermits or strange encounters that some attributed to surviving holdouts. None of these later reports were conclusively verified, and most historians believe that by the mid-1980s, all holdouts had either died, been discovered, or successfully integrated into local societies under false identities. The phenomenon of Japanese holdouts has been extensively studied by historians, psychologists, and military analysts. It offers insights into the power of ideology and indoctrination, the human capacity for endurance, the psychological effects of isolation, and the difficulty of accepting paradigm shifts in worldview. From a military perspective, holdouts demonstrate both the effectiveness of training soldiers for guerrilla warfare and long-term resistance, and the danger of creating soldiers so committed that they cannot adapt to changing circumstances. The Imperial Japanese Army succeeded in creating warriors who would fight indefinitely without surrender, but it failed to create mechanisms for ending that fight when strategic circumstances changed. This created the tragic spectacle of soldiers fighting for decades after their cause was lost, unable to escape the mental frameworks that had sustained them. From a psychological perspective, holdouts provide case studies in extreme isolation, commitment, and cognitive dissonance. How did men like Onoda maintain absolute belief in their mission despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary? Psychologists point to several factors. First, the complete commitment demanded by their training created a mental state, where questioning orders or accepting defeat became psychologically impossible. Their entire identity was wrapped up in being soldiers, in following orders, in serving their emperor. To accept that the war had ended and their sacrifice was meaningless would require abandoning their core identity, something most people cannot do easily. Second, the isolation reinforced their beliefs. Without contrary voices, without people challenging their assumptions, their original beliefs calcified into unshakable convictions. Third, the longer they remained in hiding, the more difficult it became to come out. The psychological burden of admitting they had wasted years became heavier with each passing year, creating a vicious cycle where continued hiding seemed preferable to facing the consequences of their choices. From a historical perspective, Japanese holdouts represent the final chapter of World War II, a conflict that officially ended in 1945 but whose personal consequences continued for decades. They also symbolize the broader challenge Japan faced in transitioning from a militaristic empire to a peaceful democracy. Just as individual holdouts struggled to accept that the war had ended and that the Japan they fought for no longer existed, Japanese society as a whole struggled with similar questions about identity, values, and how to move forward from a traumatic past. The treatment of holdouts, the media coverage they received, and the public debates about their actions all reflected broader societal tensions about remembering the war and reconciling conflicting narratives about Japan's wartime conduct and post-war transformation. In popular culture, holdouts have been portrayed in films, books, documentaries, and other media, often in ways that romanticize their endurance while downplaying the tragedy of their situations. Hiroo Onoda's story, in particular, has been adapted multiple times with varying degrees of accuracy and sensitivity. Some portrayals present him as a heroic figure, the ultimate loyal soldier, while others question whether his commitment represented strength or stubborn refusal to accept reality. These different portrayals reflect ongoing debates in Japanese and international society about the nature of loyalty, the meaning of duty, and the line between admirable perseverance and tragic inflexibility. Holdouts have become symbols used to illustrate different points depending on the teller's perspective. To some, they represent the best of Japanese values: dedication, discipline, and unwavering commitment. To others, they represent the worst of militarism: blind obedience, inability to think critically, and waste of human potential. The question of whether holdouts should be admired or pitied remains contentious. There is no doubt that their physical endurance and survival skills were remarkable. Surviving for decades in hostile environments with minimal resources demonstrates extraordinary capabilities. However, this physical achievement came at enormous cost. Holdouts missed marriages, families, careers, and the opportunity to contribute to their nation's post-war recovery. They existed in a state of suspended animation while the world moved forward. Their steadfast commitment to obsolete orders prevented them from participating in history, reducing them to footnotes and curiosities. Is there glory in such sacrifice, or is it merely tragic waste? The answer likely depends on one's perspective on the values of duty, obedience, and individual judgment. Those who value absolute commitment to orders and loyalty above all else may view holdouts as heroes. Those who value critical thinking, adaptability, and the ability to recognize when circumstances have changed may view them as victims of their own inflexibility and their military's indoctrination. What is undeniable is that the stories of Japanese holdouts remain compelling decades after the last one emerged from hiding. They continue to fascinate because they touch on fundamental questions about human nature, about what we believe, what we commit to, and how we respond when our fundamental assumptions about reality are challenged. In an age of rapid change, constant information flow, and frequent paradigm shifts, the image of men living in the jungle, convinced that a war ended decades ago, continues still seems almost incomprehensible. Yet at the same time, it resonates. How many of us cling to outdated beliefs, refuse to accept uncomfortable truths, or remain committed to causes or ideas that no longer serve us? The holdouts took this human tendency to an extreme, but the underlying psychological mechanisms are universal. We all have our own jungles, our own missions that may have become obsolete, our own difficulties accepting that the world has changed. In this sense, the holdouts serve as mirrors, reflecting back to us our own struggles with change, loss, and letting go. The legacy of Japanese holdouts extends beyond individual stories to influence military training and policy worldwide. Modern military forces have studied the holdout phenomenon to understand both its advantages and disadvantages. The ability to operate independently behind enemy lines for extended periods remains valuable in certain scenarios. However, the inability to recognize when to cease operations and the psychological damage caused by extreme isolation are recognized as serious problems. Modern training emphasizes not just combat skills and survival techniques, but also communication, psychological resilience, and clear protocols for ending missions. Military planners have worked to ensure that future soldiers will not find themselves in the position of the Japanese holdouts, fighting wars that have already ended because they lack reliable information or clear orders to stand down. The reconciliation between former holdouts and the nations where they hid has been complex and varied. Some former holdouts, like Hiroo Onoda, returned to the countries where they had been in hiding to apologize and make amends. Onoda visited the Philippines multiple times, meeting with families of people killed during his holdout period and providing financial assistance to communities affected by his actions. These gestures of reconciliation were met with mixed responses. Some appreciated the acknowledgement and the attempts to make amends. Others felt that no amount of apology or money could compensate for lost lives and decades of fear. The question of forgiveness in these contexts is deeply personal and varies from individual to individual and community to community. What is clear is that the impact of holdouts extended far beyond their personal experiences to affect countless other lives, creating ripples of consequence that continued for generations. For the individuals who were holdouts, their final years varied widely. Some, like Onoda, found ways to live with their past, even taking pride in their experience and using it to teach others about survival, discipline, and commitment. Others struggled with depression, guilt, and the sense that they had wasted their lives. Some integrated successfully into modern Japanese society, finding work, marrying, and living relatively normal lives despite their unusual pasts. Others remained forever alienated, unable to bridge the gap between the world they remembered and the world they found themselves in. Many died without fully processing or coming to terms with their experiences, taking their inner conflicts to the grave. The psychological scars, while not always visible, were real and lasting, affecting not just the holdouts themselves, but their families and communities as well. Today, all known Japanese holdouts have passed away. Hiroo Onoda, the most famous, died in 2014 at age 91. Shoichi Yokoi died in 1997 at age 82. The others who survived to be rescued have also since died, bringing to a close a unique chapter in military history. Their stories, however, remain relevant and continue to be studied, discussed, and debated. They serve as reminders of the human cost of war, the power of indoctrination, the importance of clear communication in military operations, and the difficulty of accepting change. As we move further from World War II and the generation that lived through it passes away, the stories of holdouts become part of history rather than living memory. Yet they retain their power to shock, fascinate, and provoke reflection on fundamental questions about duty, loyalty, truth, and the human capacity for both extraordinary endurance and tragic self-deception. The phenomenon of soldiers who didn't know the war had ended stands as one of the most unusual and poignant legacies of World War II. These men, scattered across Pacific islands and Asian jungles, living in caves and makeshift shelters, maintaining weapons and discipline long after they served any purpose, represent something profound about the human condition. They were not cowards or deserters, but men who took their orders seriously, perhaps too seriously. They were not rebels, but the ultimate conformists, following commands even when those commands led them into decades of isolation and hardship. Their stories challenge our understanding of rationality, asking how intelligent, capable individuals could maintain beliefs so at odds with reality for so long. They challenge our understanding of commitment, showing both the nobility and the tragedy of absolute dedication to a cause. And they challenge our understanding of identity, demonstrating how our sense of self can become so tied to a role, a mission, or a set of beliefs that we cannot let them go, even when they no longer serve us. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this video informative and that the stories of these remarkable individuals have given you insight into a fascinating and tragic chapter of history. If you enjoyed learning about the Japanese soldiers who didn't know World War II had ended, make sure to check out our video about what happened to German U-boats after the war, another incredible story of the conflict's aftermath. The dedication, survival, and human complexity revealed in these holdout stories remind us that history is not just about battles and treaties, but about individual human beings, caught in extraordinary circumstances, making choices that would shape the rest of their lives. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more fascinating World War II content. We have many more incredible stories to share, and we'd love to have you join us for them. See you in the next one.